Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting chapter in our dive into the book of Shmuel. Again, just to remind you, we're doing kind of a mini series now. We're doing a very quick wash through, looking specifically at the characters. So last week we looked at Shmuel, and this week we are going to continue with Shmuel because there's a lot to talk about with Shmuel. After all, the book is named after him for a reason. However, there's going to be a lot of overlap in today's class with the story of Shaul of Saul. And Shmuel and Shaul are really joined. As soon as Shaul comes into the picture, in a way, this is when we really see Shmuel kind of the way we remember him, the way we think of him as being a prophet who works alongside a king. And we're going to see how the book kind of sets up that situation, how Shmuel himself in the book, in the narrative, kind of sets up this is how it's going to be. I'm not leaving, right? Because the normal situation would be, and we're going to look at the text inside in just a moment, the normal situation would be, if you recall, Shmuel is the last of the Shoftim, the judges slash judge rulers, the governors of the people of Israel, who would come when they needed, where there's no expectation of heredity of leaving the office to their children. They were all one-off leaders. Shmuel is the last of those. He actually counts himself as the last of those, as we'll see. So normally, if he's appointing a king, shouldn't he just disappear? But no, he doesn't. And he's going to set that up himself. So let's take a look inside. So where we left our hero, Shmuel, we were in Perek, that's chapter 8. And the people of Israel had asked Shmuel for a king. Shmuel is old, his sons are not worthy, they are corrupt. And so the nation gathers to Shmuel and says, we need a king. We want a king like everyone else. And Shmuel doesn't like this, if you will recall. So on your screen, you will see that chapter. And they said to him, they say, Ata sima lanu melech l'shoftenu k'chol goyim. Place a king over us so that he can to rule over us, to govern us, just as all the nations have. Because the nations in general don't have judges like we've had, one-off judges. They have kings. And we know Vayeraba davar b'nei Shmuel. Shmuel did not like this. This thing was bad in Shmuel's eyes. Vayitpalel, I'm skipping a little. Vayitpalel Shmuel el Hashem. And Shmuel prayed to God. Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, Shma b'kol ha'am, l'chol asher yamru elecha, ki lo otcha masu, ki oti masu, mimloch alehem. What can we tell from the divine answer to Shmuel? God says, do what they ask, because they're not actually rebelling against you. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me, their God. So we understand already that part of the reason Shmuel didn't like this idea that they had a king was he saw it as a personal rejection of himself from rule. And God is telling him, no, they're actually rejecting me, God, because they're not trusting that kind of I can take care of them. And God continues, K'chol ha'ma'asim asher asu miyom ha'aloti otam miMitzrayim v'ad hayom hazeh ve'azvuni ve'avdu Elohim acherim ken hema osim gam lach. And God says to Shmuel, this is kind of fun. He's like, they've been doing this to me for years, God says to Shmuel. He says, the same way I took them out of Egypt. And until this day, they keep believing me and they serve other gods. That's what they're doing to you. You know, that's the way these guys are. They serve other gods and they want another ruler. V'ata shma b'kolam, ach ki ha'ed ta'id bahem v'gadta lahem mishpat ha'melech asher yimloch alehem. And now listen to their voices. In other words, listen to what they want. But you need to warn them. You essentially testify to them, but you need to tell them what the rules of a king are, who's going to rule over them. They have to know what they're getting into. Now, when it says mishpat hamelech, does that mean the law of the king? Is he actually going to everything that Shmuel tells them? Are these things that a king is allowed to do? Or is he simply warning them and saying, these are things a king can get away with? These are things that a king can do to you. So much later on in the Gemara, in the Talmud, there's an argument between Rav and Shmuel, not this Shmuel, Rav and Shmuel, the Amoraim, right? The Talmudic scholars. They argue about what this is. Was it simply Rav says it's just Shmuel trying to scare them? Shmuel says, the rabbinic Shmuel says it's Shmuel's actually saying the law for the king, that a king's actually allowed to do these things. So that's a rabbinic disagreement about what a king is actually allowed to do. And when they're talking about a king, what a king is allowed to do, they're talking about an Israelite king, right? A Jewish king, essentially, because a non-Jewish king is not going to care what he's allowed to do according to the Torah. So it becomes important because Shmuel kind of goes into depth about what they can expect. So let's take a look. Shmuel reported what God said to everyone who asked for a king from him. Vayomer ze yeh mishpat hamelech asher yimloch alechem et bnechem yikach v'samu b'merkavto u'b'farashav v'ratzu lefnei merkavto. He says, this is what the king's going to do. He's warning them about this is what a king can do. This is what a king will do. What's he going to do? He's going to grab your sons. He's going to take your sons and he's going to have them work for him. He's going to be his charioteers, his riders. They're going to run in front of his chariot, right? He's going to make them officers in his army. They're going to make them plow his fields and reap his harvest. They're just going to work for him. They're going to create all his instruments of war. He's going to take your daughters for workers too. Notice he doesn't go quite as far as we might worry what he's going to take your daughters to do. No, but he's going to take your daughters and they're going to be working for him as perfumers or people who create incense, as cooks, as bakers. He's going to grab your fields. He's going to give your fields, your groves, etc. He's going to give them to his servants, his entourage, who he is fond of, right? And he's going to take 1/10 of your grain and your grapes, and he's going to give it to his liseli sub v'lavadav, again, to his eunuchs and courtiers, to the members of his court, those who serve him most closely. He's going to take everything. He's going to take your slaves, your maidservants, your young men, your donkeys. He's going to take everything for his service. He's going to take 1/10 of your sheep. And then, then you're going to cry out to God about this king, and God's not going to listen to you. Why? Because you asked for this king and you got the king and now he's your problem, right? So don't think you can come running to God complaining about your king. This is the deal, all right? And we know that this was meant to be a warning and to scare them off because it says, "Vayimanu ha'am l'shma b'kol Shmuel, vayomru lo ki im melech yeh alenu." The nation absolutely refused to listen to Shmuel, and they said, no, because we're going to have a king. So in other words, we don't care what you say. So it's very clear that what Shmuel was saying was meant to be a warning and was meant to scare them off, as opposed to being a now I am telling you legal rules, or not only legal rules. The fact is, again, the kings can do pretty much what they want when it comes to seizing property if there's no one there to stop them. As we're going to see that as an issue later on. And so they say, no, we will have a king. We're going to be like all the nations. Our king is going to govern us. He's going to rule over us, and he's going to go in front of us in all our wars. Why is this important? Because, again, they're under attack by the Philistines, by the Plishtim, and this is something that's really top of mind for them, the idea of the war. And they want a warrior king to go ahead of them in battle, not just to govern them, but to lead them in battle. Now, Shmuel has prayed for them to be successful in battle. He's been pretty good so far, but he's not a warrior, and that's what they're looking for. Cheryl, you had a question?
Yeah, as a writer and as a reader, I feel that there's a big part of the story here that's unnarrated, that we don't know enough. And, you had a beautiful comment last week that Shmuel has been this itinerant showcase. And there's part of me as a reader They would love to see him in action as a shofet. And it's so interesting that we get him as a child and a young man, and then he's 52. And we don't know about all of the years in between when he's really exhausting himself, when he's trying to be as assiduous and as careful as he can be with people. And I feel that there's a picture of him here that's missing in the story.
We do kind of run through Shmuel's life up till this point, and we had this kind of idea right after Shmuel kind of succeeds Eli that he judges. I do want to remind you that Shmuel has called everyone to repentance. We have gotten a verse saying that everything that Shmuel said essentially came true. Like everything that Shmuel spoke was true, and that he was able to kind of be a good leader for Israel. The fact is that most of the book is really focusing on the rise of the kings of Israel, right? The rise of our first kings. And that's why Shmuel's life is just summarized. We have the very beginning of Shmuel's life. And I think you make a very good point, especially since right now we're talking about Shmuel and what Shmuel's character was and what his importance was. So we have just enough to see him kind of as a spiritual leader and as a governor of Israel after we have his kind of miraculous setup, almost like he's born not quite naturally, and he then has a revelation of God when he's still a young man or boy, and then he can take on that role of leading the people and also being their spiritual leader. But we're running through that so that we can get to the first kings, because the book really is centering on how did we get those first kings, what were they like, what's the story around them, right? And that's what takes us to this point where everyone comes to him and says, we need a king. And he says, a king's going to be awful. And they're like, no, we need a king. We need someone who's going to lead us in battle. And from that point on, the question is, so what is Shmuel's role going to be? And he actually is going to kind of set that up in one of the chapters that I hope that we should get to tonight. After Shaul has really been established as king, Shmuel makes it clear, as we'll see, that I'm not going anywhere. Because that's what you would expect. You would say, okay, here's the king. He was the governor. He was the shofet. Now Shmuel should be going away. I mean, he's old, right? He should be going away. And he's like, no, I'm not going anywhere. And kind of, this is why.
Sefer Devarim clearly outlines that Bnei Israel have permission, maybe even commandment, to have a king. Why is Shmuel so astounded? Why is God so flabbergasted?
It's one of the interesting parts of it's interesting because up to this point there hasn't been a king, right? Up to this point, there's been a setup where whenever the people, and we have that setup in the book of Shoftim, right? In the book of Judges, right? Where whenever there's a problem, the people of Israel call to God and he sends them a leader, right? And that's a different kind of setup that Shmuel thinks is a-okay. You could say, but in Devarim it says to have a king. He thinks this is fine. The way it's being presented, certainly, in these chapters, is that that's a more of a direct connection to God. That you have a leader that's essentially been chosen by God himself that comes to you. And we've already seen that passing on your rule to your sons is bad, right? That's what we've seen in the book so far, right? Eli's sons are bad. Shmuel's sons are bad. Why do we want to set up a king who's going to have sons who one would assume are going to be bad, right?
And whoever wrote the book of Shoftim keeps commenting, this is chaos, this is terrible, there's no king. So.
Right. So you should know, it's important to note, and it's pretty clear when you read the book of Shoftim. So there are the stories themselves, and then there's the frame. So the framework of the book of Shoftim absolutely is, that's when there was no king, and everyone did whatever he wanted, right? In the stories themselves, that's not necessarily, it's not always the way it's set up. And if we were learning the book of Shoftim, we could see how there are like positive judges, positive, like calling them judges, right? Okay, because I'm using them translating the word shofet, but we mean, leaders, positive leaders, and then negative leaders, and that leads us very nicely into this is why we need a king, right? But we have this refrain in the book, that's when there was no king and everyone did whatever they wanted, right? At the same time, so that frame is obviously being written when there's a king, right?
Right.
But when there's no king, it seems like there was absolutely not, even when there's no king, because in the narration of Shmuel, our omniscient narrator seems to be at least a little bit on Shmuel's side, right? He's not saying Shmuel's wrong. On the contrary, he's like, no, they still didn't listen. They still didn't listen, right? And we're going to see later on, much later on, in Sefer Melachim, in the Book of Kings, right, where Ahav actually does. He has someone killed to take his land for a pleasure garden, which is, he's like, hey, I'm a king, and that's what I'll do. And what's interesting is that he's not allowed to do that. What's interesting thing is he's punished for that. He's going to be punished for that. That was a horrible thing, right? That's where we get the line "Haratzachta v'gam yarashta," right? Did you murder and also inherit, right?
Although he delegates it to his wife.
Yeah, he delegates it, right? Because in fact, it's not what you're supposed to be able to do as a king, right? There is supposed to be a limit to what you're allowed to grab as a king, as we see with David, right? And the idea is, and I think that's also one of the reasons why, even though this in the book, it's called Mishpat HaMelech, right? Literally the law of the king. It's hard to believe that what it means is the law of the king. I prefer to kind of side with Rav in this, that it's all kind of, this is what the king could try to do, could that will, and the king could get, in theory, could get away with it, but it's not like really what he's allowed to do. And you can always tell what a king is kind of allowed to do by what he sneaks around to do. If he's sneaking around to do it, then he's not really allowed to do it, right? It's not really acceptable for him to do it. So in other words, yes, Sefer Devarim absolutely sets up this idea that you have a king, and that's why they call it the Deuteronomistic history, right? If you ever open if you're a Bible critic or a Bible academic, we'll talk about the Deuteronomistic history. And it's like Deuteronomy through Kings, right? Because the idea is through the book of Kings, because the idea is that you have this idea of a king, right? And that idea of a king is going to be very much color the books that are written. But what we see is that in the book of Shmuel, it's interesting because it's clearly being written from the point of view of people who are living under a king. Because by the point of view that Shmuel is written, there are kings. But it's very sympathetic to what Shmuel is saying, in that you really don't want a king, do you? Like, this is not really what you want. But in a way, it's also almost inevitable. In other words, it is kind of saying this is why we have a king, but it also feels inevitable. God says to Shmuel, listen to them. Listen to them. They want a king. That's the sort of people they are. You're learning it now. I've known it always. Just let them have a king. And you'll see that even when they get a king, they're not, in the beginning, it takes a while for them to accept the king they've got. So let's dive back in.
Miriam,
Yes.
this term of people running in front of his chariot, if it was such it was customary, like maybe in the Middle East, in the ancient times.
East, yeah. In the Near East, I think the part what's galling here is, of course, he's going to have to take your sons to battle because the nation is at war, and they would expect that they will have to go to battle. But to take your sons to just run in front of his chariot as some kind of display, that's something a king does because he doesn't care. That's what a king does because he can have his whole thing is like, look at me, and I have wealth and I have power, and let's just take some of your young men to run in front of my chariot for show. Right? As opposed to, now he also says that he's going to take your sons to be commanders. I think the idea of why should it be bad he's taking your sons to be commanders, because a regular soldier, certainly at this point, a regular soldier, when you're at war, they take the soldier and then they send him home. Like he goes to battle. When you're done, he goes home. But an officer doesn't. An officer is gone. So if he takes your son to be an officer, like someone in charge of like 100 soldiers, you're not seeing him again. He's not coming home to work the farm. So that's the issue there. So let me go back to where we left Shmuel. Despite the fact that Shmuel has warned them, they say, no, this is what we want. And we want this person to go in front of, he should go out in front of us to fight our wars. And so Shmuel heard everything the nation said, and he reported it back to God, right? Shmuel, Shma b'kolam, v'imlachta lehem melech, v'yomer Shmuel al anshe Yisrael, l'chu ish li'iro. So God says, listen to them and set a king over them. Listen, just do it. And so Shmuel says to everyone, go home. So we don't know. Shmuel doesn't seem to say, Shmuel's like, maybe he said, leave it with me, or maybe he just said, go home, right? But he says, go home. And now it's meanwhile back at the ranch time, right? We're going, okay, stock frame, right? Now we're going to follow just someone out of the blue. Vayhi Ishmi Binyamin, Ushmo Kish ben Aviel, ben Surah, ben Bechorat, ben Afiach, ben Ishimini, Gibor Chayil. There is a man in Binyamin whose name is Kish. He gives his whole family tree, and he is a Benjaminite, and he is a Gibor Chayil. He is like a war hero. ולא היה בן ושמו שאול בחור וטוב, ואין איש מבני ישראל טוב ממנו, משכמו ומעלה גבוה מכל העם. He has a son named Shaul who is a really good guy, right? There's no one who's better. No one of the Israelites is better than him, perhaps stronger than him. Certainly there's an idea of him being good looking. Mishikmo v'mal gavon, he's a head taller than anyone else, but he also apparently his appearance is striking. And I'm going to shorten this story. There are donkeys that go missing. And his father says to him, go take a servant along and go find the donkeys. So they go all over the place. They go all over Binyamin, up to Tzuf, and they haven't found the donkeys. And Shaul says to a servant, let's go back. We can't find these donkeys. And the servant's like, no, wait. There is an Ish Elohim in this town. There is some kind of prophet in this town. There's someone who is someone who's got a divine sight in that town. Va'ish nechbad kol asher yedaber bo yavo. The man is very respected. Anything he says comes true. Says, let's go there and he'll help us, essentially help us find the donkeys. And Shaul says, but we don't have anything to give him. If we're going to ask him to help us find the donkeys, we have to give him something. We have nothing. And the servant says, no, I've got a leva shekel kesef. I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. We'll give it to him. V'higid lanu et dalkenu, and he will tell us our path. And of course, already it's setting us up. The servant means he's going to tell us our path to find the donkeys. We, the readers, know he's going to tell us our path for our whole future, right? And it tells us, Lefanim b'Yisrael, ko amar ha'ish b'lechto lidrosh Elohim, l'chu v'nelcha ad haro'eh, ki lanavi hayom yikareh lefanim haro'eh. So it says, in those days, when someone wanted to ask something of God, they would say, let's go to the seer. Because prophets used to be called seers. Okay? And that's telling us that later on, when Shaul calls him a seer, we'll understand. Now, up to this point, no one said the name Shmuel, because we're all supposed to be in suspense. We don't know yet what's going to happen. We don't know who the man of God is who is going to speak. And we're still calling them the man of God. So Shaul's like, okay, this is great. We'll give a quarter shekel of silver. Let's go. They go up, and all the young women, they meet all the young women. And this is another way we know that Shaul is good looking, because all the women just start speaking over themselves to tell him what's going on, right? The young women are going out to draw water. He says, is the seer here? Yes, He said that they answer them and they say, yes, here he is before you. Maher ataki hayom ba'ala'ir. Hurry now because he's come to the city today. Ki zebach hayom la'am b'bama, because there's a sacrifice today at the high place, right? They're going to have a sacrifice at the bama. כבואכם העיר כן תמצאון אותו, בטרם יעלה הבמה לאכול, כי לא יאכל העם עד בואו. It literally, like you see in the translation here, it's giving you different quotes because that is the best way to read this. That each young woman is kind of saying her little bit to give Shaul some information. And they're telling him, listen, you're going to find him as soon as you come to the city. No one is going to eat until he comes to bless the sacrifice. Right? And afterwards, all the guests will eat, right? But now go up and you'll find him. So they go up. And meanwhile, now we're switching to Shmuel. V'Hashem gala et ozen Shmuel yom echad lifnei bo Shaul lemor. God said to Shmuel a day before Shaul came there, saying, Ke'et machar eshlach elecha ish me'eretz Binyamin, ומשחתו לנגיד על עמי ישראל, והושיע את עמי מיד פלישתים, כי ראיתי את עמי, כי באת צעקתו אליי. He says, I'm going to send you a man from the land of Benjamin. You will anoint him to be the leader of my nation Israel. He will save my people from the Plishtim, from the Philistines, because I saw that my nation, because my nation's cry has come before me. ושמואל ראה את שאול, והשם ענהו, הנה האיש אשר אמרתי אליך, זה יעצור בעמי. Right? Shmuel sees Shaul, and God says to him, this is the guy. This is the guy I told you about. ויגש שאול את שמואל בתוך השער, ויאמר הגיד נא לי איזה בית הרואה. So Shmuel actually, so Shaul goes up to Shmuel, and he says, hey, where's the house of the seer? He says to Shmuel. And Shmuel says to Shaul, I'm the seer, okay? And come up before me to the bama, and you'll eat with me today, okay? And your donkeys, the donkeys that you've lost 3 days ago, don't worry about it. They're found. Ulemi kol chemdat Yisrael halo lecha ulchol bet avicha. Who is all of Israel yearning for? Just you and the house of your father. So forget about the donkeys. You're going to be king. Vayan Shaul vayomer, Halo Benyamini anochi, miktane shivtei Yisrael, umishpachti hatzira mikol mishpachot shivtei Binyamin, velama dibarte elai kadavar hazeh. Shaul, being very modest, he says, I'm from the smallest, least important of the tribes. My family is the least important of the families, the youngest of the families of the tribe of Binyamin. Why have you said this thing to me? Shmuel doesn't really answer. Shmuel takes him and he brings him among the guests. There are about 30 guests. Shmuel gives him a special portion. And then in the morning, he says, okay, come up with me to the roof. On the roof, no one's going to bother them. They can talk privately on the roof. And Shmuel sends Shaul off. They go to the edge of the city. And Shmuel says, send your servant ahead. And now stand and I'll tell you what God wants. ויקח שמואל את פח השמן, ויצוק על ראשו, וישקהו. ויאמר הלא כי משכחה השם על נחלתו לנגיד. So he takes his little bottle of oil, he pours it on his head, and he kisses him. And he says, God has anointed you to be a leader over his people. And then he tells him everything that's going to happen to him from the time he leaves him. In other words, so that he will believe him, Shmuel then gives him a series of events that will happen to him. Okay? And all of them, of course, happen. So he says, so now I'm just gonna go over very quickly. He's going to, you'll meet two men by the tomb of Rachel, by Furat Rachel, that's on the edge of Binyamin at Tzeltzach. And they're going to tell you that your donkeys were found and your father's worried about you. And then you're going to go to Alon Tavor, and there you're going to find 3 people who are on their way to Beit El. And one is going to be carrying, going to be carrying different things. They're going to offer you 2 loaves of bread. You should accept them. Really, literally, he's giving him kind of an idea of everything that's going to happen. So you should know that Shmuel's right about this stuff, and he's right about you being king also. Right? This is to prove that Shmuel's right about being king. Okay, now I'm just going to, now this is the important part. After that, Achal Ken Tavo Giv'at Elohim Asher Sham Netivei Plishtim. והיא כבואכה שם העיר, ופגעת חבל נביאים יורדים מהבמה, ולפניהם נבל וטוב וחליל וכינור, והם המתנבאים. Afterwards, you're going to come to something called the Hill of God. This is where there are Philistine representatives, and you're going to meet a group of prophets. And they're going to have musical instruments with them, and they're going to be mitnabim. They're going to be in the midst of ecstatic prophecy. וצלחה עליך רוח השם, והתנבאת עמם ונהפכת לאיש אחר. You are going to, the Spirit of God will come down on you. You are going to go into ecstatic prophecy with them, and you will become a different person. Okay? This different person that you're going to become, it's a hint, not just to the fact that he's going to be a different person in ecstatic prophecy. This is going to raise him. He's going to get the Spirit of God. And from now on, you will be a king. You're going to be someone else. When you'll know when all these things happen to you, that God is with you. Okay. He says, and then you go to Gilgal and wait for me for 7 days. ויקף נוטו שכמו ללכת מעם שמואל, ויהפוך לו אלוהים לב אחר, ויבוא כל האותות האלה ביום ההוא. And when he turned, as soon as he turned his away to leave Shmuel, God actually gave him a different heart. God already made him different. And he had all these signs. And it skips all of the unimportant signs, and it comes to him coming to the group of prophets. ותצלח עליו רוח אלוהים ויתנבא בתוכם. And in fact, the Spirit of God comes on him, and he goes into ecstatic prophecy among them. Everyone who knew him from before sees him prophesying with the prophets. They say, what is going on with the son of Kish? Is Shaul also among the prophets? That's going to come back again, still in the Shmuel story with Shaul, where this is going to be, of course, ironic and sad and tragic. But right now, what this means is Shaul has become someone else, right? And someone said, and who are their fathers? Like, who are these people? Who are their father? All these other people who are prophets were their fathers. That's why it became a phrase that people say, is Shaul also among the prophets? And he goes, anyway, so Shaul's uncle asked him, where'd you go? He said to look for donkeys. And then we went to Shmuel, and Shaul's uncle said, what did Shmuel say? He said, she just told us the donkeys had been found, right? Nothing about being a king. Shaul is keeping mum. Shmuel calls everyone up to Mitzpah. Remember that this is where Shmuel is. This is Shmuel's center. And he gives them a whole lecture about how crummy they were for asking for a king, right? Vayomer al bnei Yisrael, Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, Anochi aleiti et Yisrael miMitzrayim, v'atzil etchem miyad Mitzrayim, u'miyad kol hamamachot halochatzim etchem. God says, I took you out of Egypt. I saved you from the hand of Egypt and all the other kingdoms that were oppressing you. V'atem hayom ma'astem et Elohechem asher hu mosheh lachem mikol ra'atochem. mikol ra'otechem v'tzarotechem v'tomu lo ki melech tasim aleinu v'ata hityatvu lifnei Hashem l'shetechem u'la'alfechem. He said, okay, but you rejected your God who saved you by saying we're going to put a king over us. And then Shmuel brings over all of the tribes, and he doesn't say this is your king. What he does is he casts lots. He casts lots to show them this is from God, right? He casts lots. First comes out the Binyamin. When he casts lots for the families of Binyamin, it comes out the Matri family. And then the lot falls on Shaul, the son of Kish. Vayivakshuhu v'lo nimtza. And they look for him, they can't find him. It's a very important day to be found, especially when you know that you're actually the king. but he's not around. Vaishalu od bashem hava od halom ish, vayomer Hashem hinehu nechba ala kelim. They ask God, where is there someone here? And God says, in some prophetic way, you're like they get some kind of prophecy that here he is hiding among all of the stuff, right? All the kelim, all the vessels and things that are on the side there. That's where he is. וירוצו ויקחו משם, ויצצה בתוך העם, ויגבע מכל העם משכמו ומעלה. They came, they took him out, and he is a head taller than everyone else. ויאמר שמואל, and Shmuel's like, see? ויאמר שמואל על כל העם, הראיתם אשר בחר בו השם? כי אין כמוהו בכל העם. ויריעו כל העם, ויאמרו יחי המלך. And so Shmuel's like, see, there's no one like him. Look at how tall he is, right? And everyone says, yay! And they say, long live the king. And Shmuel gives them the rules of kingship, and they write them down in a book, and then Shmuel sends everyone home. Now Shaul also goes home, right? It says, but some people who have already been inspired by him, because God essentially has inspired them, they go with him. In other words, he has an entourage that goes with him. But, uvnei Belial amru, ma yoshienu zeh? Vayivzuhu v'lo heviu lo mincha vayhi kemacharish. Right? There are other people who are saying, this guy's not going to save us. And they essentially made fun of him. They scorned him, and they didn't bring any gifts to him. They didn't consider him a king. And he just didn't say anything about it. He just didn't make a point out of it. But there are people who haven't accepted him. And he just went home, right? He's not acting as a king. Now, we're going to come back to this later, but what happens is Shaul essentially proves himself in the battle over Yavesh Gilad, where Nachash, the Ammoni, essentially attacks them. Shaul saves them, but he saves them in a way where he inspires, he calls the people to him and then makes battle. So he does everything the king needs to do. In other words, he inspires the people and he goes to battle and he wins. Yes.
Quick question. You read that short passage there where God is rebuking the people. I mean,
Yes.
It's very sharp. And it's just like water off a duck's back. There's like no reaction from the people.
Right.
Surprising.
Right. Well, they've already decided they want a king. I mean, it's interesting because it's one of those rebukes where you guys suck. Let's see how this turns out for you, right? They've already decided. It's kind of hard when it's already like, okay, despite everything I did for you, you asked for a king. So you know what? Go ahead, you get your king, right? They're not going to turn back now. They're finally going to get the king. So it's true. But again, the idea is if they didn't take Shmuel's warning the first time, they're not going to listen this time either, is the idea. And especially since now they're actually getting a king. It's what's strange is, and I will agree, it's very strange that you have this thing where God is giving them a king at the same time as he's saying to them, you guys are awful for wanting a king. It's a very weird mix. And you get that throughout this story, right? Shmuel is essentially that. Well, Shmuel really would rather not give them a king, right? But God in this whole passage, this whole thing, also the way he speaks to Shmuel, no, they shouldn't want a king, but they do want a king. You know what? I'm giving them a king. And I think that a big part of it is also setting up this idea where this is why you need a prophet, right? Because a king is not perfect. And again, we talked about this before, this idea that in a lot of ancient traditions, so the king is divine, the king is somehow perfect, you can't disagree with the king, and that's not the way Israelite kings work. And part of it, I think, is in terms of the way the book of Shmuel is setting it up, part of the reason for that is that, you know what, you really shouldn't have a king anyway, because a king is a person, right? It's not God. So it's very clear then that a king needs to have a prophet alongside him to kind of to call the people to repent, but also call the king to repent and to prevent his worst traits from being allowed to run free. And the idea that no, kings are limited. Kings are human and they're not perfect at all. And so I think that's probably why we're hearing this again and again at the same time as they're in fact getting the king. In the next class, I'm going to dive a little bit more into Shaul, but also with Shmuel, because Shmuel's story, of course, is continuing. But Shmuel's story, as it continues, is very, very tied, as I said earlier, to Shaul and to his connection to Shaul. So, but let's go. Let's take a look. Yes.
May I can ask one more question?
Sure.
Is there no problem with the fact that Shaul is from the tribe of Binyamin and not from Yehuda? Like Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda doesn't come up in any way.
No, it's absolutely, it absolutely is not an issue here. It's very clear that at this point there doesn't seem to be any sort of idea that he has to come. On the contrary, it seems when you hear, "Oh, but I'm from the smallest tribe and we're the youngest family," you're like, "Okay, we've got it now," right? Because it's the youngest who usually is like the winner, right? So you're like, okay, when you hear that. And here he is, he's modest, but how could it be me? It's a classic narrative setup, and also a classic setup for Israel, because in general the oldest doesn't win, right? Ishmael is the older son. Esav is the older son, right? Reuven is the oldest son. So as soon as we hear, "Oh, I'm the youngest," we're the youngest and we're the smallest, and how can it be me? And you're like, okay, we've got a winner on our hands. So it doesn't seem to be an issue at all that the ruler needs to come from Yehuda. At least it's not an issue here. And notice he doesn't say, "But I'm not from Yehuda," right? He says, "I'm from the least important tribe." Right? He doesn't say "I'm not from a specific tribe." So no, there's no acknowledgement here that the ruler has to come from Yehuda. Okay, so let's go back to our text. Here we are. Okay. So what happens is, after the victory and the saving of the people of Yavesh Gilad, where Shaul actually proves himself. And I'm skipping now we're in Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11, and Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12. After the battle over Yavesh Gilad, Vayomer ha'am el Shmuel, mi ha'omer Shaul yimloch aleinu, tnu ha'anashim unimitem. So the nation says to Shmuel, whoever says, "Oh, will Shaul rule over us? Give us those people and we will kill them." Okay, so the people are now, after Shaul has proven himself that he can pull everyone to battle and win in battle, they all say, "We'll kill anyone who's saying he shouldn't rule." Vayomer Shaul, lo yumat ish bayom hazeh, ki hayom asa Adonai tshu'ah b'Yisrael. And Shaul, in a very honorable and kingly way, says, "No one shall be killed on this day, because this is a day that God has brought salvation and victory to Israel." Vayomer Shmuel el ha'am, l'chu v'nelcha ha'gilgal u'nechadesh sham ha'melucha. Shmuel knows what's really happened now. Before he said, "This is your king," and everyone said, "Long live the king." But now is when Shaul is really king. Now that he has proven himself, now that the people themselves are like, "This is our king," he says, "Let us go to the Gilgal, and there we will renew the monarchy." וילכו כל העם אל גילגל וימליכו שם את שאול לפני אדוני בגילגל ויזבחו שם זבחים שלמים לפני אדוני וישמח שם שאול וכל אנשי ישראל עד מאוד. So everyone goes up to the Gilgal. They declare Shaul king before God. They bring sacrifices, but says specifically zvachim shlamim, which means it's kind of a feast. Zvachim shlamim, what you bring as a sacrifice is the stuff that you're not allowed to eat. So that they essentially make a big party, and everyone is happy. Then Shmuel says, he has an interesting talk. Okay, so we're just going to do one more chapter here. That's Perek Yud Bet, chapter 12. ויאמר שמואל אל כל ישראל, הנה שמעתי בקולכם לכל אשר אמרתם לי, ואמליך עליכם מלך. I have done what you asked. I have appointed a king over you. Right now, this king is going before you. Now you really have a king, right? You accept that Shaul is a king. ואני זקנתי ואספתי, I'm old. ובניי הינם איתכם. My sons are still with you. let's not go into it, right? I've been with you since my youth. In other words, I have been leading you since my youth. הנני הנובי נגד השם ונגד משיחו, את שור מי לקחתי וחמור מי לקחתי, ואת מי השקתי, את מי רצותי, ומיד מי לקחתי חופר ועלים עיני בו, ואשיב לכם. He said, now tell me, before God and before his anointed, in other words, before God and before the king, have I taken any bribes from anyone? Have I taken anyone's property? Have I taken any bribes to misjudge anything? And tell me and I'll return it. ויאמרו לא שתנו ולא רצותנו ולא לקחת מיד איש מאומה. They said, you never cheated us, you never robbed us, you haven't taken anything from us. ויאמר עליהם עד השם בכם ועד משיחו היום הזה, כי לא מצאתם בידי מאומה. ויאמר עד. He said, okay, let it be a witness that I didn't take anything from you before God and before his anointed one. And they're like, yep, that is true. ויאמר שמואל אל העם, השם אשר עשה את משה ואת אהרון, ואשר העלה את אבותיכם מארץ מצרים, ועתה התייצבו וישבתה אתכם לפני השם את כל צדקות השם אשר עשה אתכם. He said, now I'm going to say all the good things that God did. When he appointed Moshe and Aaron to lead you, and all the good things he did, he said, essentially, that he freed them from Egypt, he delivered them from the hands of Sisera. Actually, no, it's the opposite, rather, that God, because you forgot, so God gave you over to the hand of Sisera, and gave you over to the hand of the Philistine, and gave you over to the Moabites, and you fought them. And then you called for help, and then God sent the Shoftim. Who did he send? Yerubal and Bidan and Yiftach and Shmuel. Now we know Yerubal, we know Yiftach, and we know Shmuel. You see here that Shmuel is including himself with those judges, with those governors, with those leaders who were sent each individually by God. Who is Bidan? Of course, according to Jewish tradition, Bidan is Shimshon, Samson, because he was from the tribe of Dan. In the Septuagint, it says Barak there instead of Bidan. But we don't know. There could have been some other leader named Bidan who was simply not written up. Anyway, so Shmuel says, I am one of this God sent these leaders, including me, and they saved you from your enemies, and then you were safe. But then when you saw Nachash, Melech Bnei Ammon, who came, you said, let us have a king. Now, this is possibly reflecting a different tradition, where the whole problem with Yavesh Gilead, with the Ammonites, started before they asked for a king. And he says, he said, okay, now the king that you chose, that you asked for, God gave him to you. All right? And then he says, now if you obey God and you listen, everything's going to be fine with you, the nation, and the king. But if you don't listen to God, God is still going to work against you as he did your forefathers. Then he calls and he says, even though it's the time of the seer chitim, the time of the wheat harvest, which despite that is, and that's not generally a time of rain. Those of us here in Israel know this, that it's, once you hit summertime, once you hit warm weather, you're not getting rain. Despite that, I will pray to God and he will send thunder and rain, and you're going to realize that you shouldn't have asked for a king, right? This is just a sign that you deserve a punishment. And that's what he does. He calls to God, and God, there's thunder and rain. And so the nation says to Shmuel, please pray so you and save us. And Shmuel says, don't worry. And he says, but you did this bad thing to ask for a king, but as long as you follow God and you serve God with all your heart, but don't follow worthless things. Don't follow the tohu, the things that are just formless and worthless, because they won't help you. God is not going to desert you. God wants you to be his people. מחדול להתפלל בעדכם, והוריתי אתכם בדרך הטובה והישרה. And I too, Shmuel, see how we're coming back to Shmuel here. I too, Shmuel, I would never want to sin against God. I will never stop praying for you and showing you the right path. In other words, Shmuel says, why did Shmuel have this whole talk about you guys were bad, you asked for a king, look, I'm going to call down rain and thunder, to say to them, okay, guys, you've got a king. If you stop following God, it's not going to help you a bit. On the contrary, God's going to punish you. That's why I, Shmuel, am here. I will continue to pray for you, and I will continue to lead you to the right path. I am not going anywhere, right? And you know that I'm not corrupt, because we started this saying, have I ever taken anything from you? No, I'm not doing this for wealth. I'm not doing this for greed. I am doing this because just as you must follow God, I must follow God. My job is to pray for you before God and also to make sure that you're doing the right thing and to bring you back to the right path. And he finishes with, יראו את אדוני ועבדתם אותו באמת בכל לבבכם, כי ראו את אשר הגדיל עמכם. But fear God and serve him with truth with all your heart, because and see that he has really done a great kindnesses with you. ואם הרע תרעו גם אתם גם מלככם תיספו. But if you do bad, you'll be destroyed, and so will your king. So just having a king is not enough. You need someone, you need to do good. He needs to do good. And here I am, Shmuel, alongside you, ready to pray for you and to bring you back to the right path. And so Shmuel is not going to go gently into that good night. He is going to continue as a leader of the people alongside Shaul. And that's going to cause friction with Shaul. Not just what's going to end up happening is Shaul is essentially going to lose his kingship, not really his kingship. He's going to lose the ability to pass on his kingly status to his son because of it. Okay, so we see how Shmuel's story and Shaul's story are very much mixed. At this point, Shmuel is going to be going alongside Shaul, and Shaul's failings are going to be very much connected to his not listening or not waiting for Shmuel, besides his, obviously, the idea that he is not strong enough to stand up to the people as he should. And we'll be seeing that more next week. So thank you for joining me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Take care, everyone. Have a good week. Bye.